The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
You know, in a functioning, healthy church, you become part of that healthy community. You are grafted into this story. And I think that's something that why a healthy church is so vital in this incredibly fractious time where so many people's stories have gone wrong.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. David French is a political and cultural commentator and senior editor at The Dispatch. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic Monthly and is the author of several books, including Divided We Fall, American Secession Threats, and How to Restore Our Nation. He's the co-host with Curtis Chang of the new podcast, Good Faith. David French is a former attorney and an Army veteran, having served as a squadron judge advocate in Iraq. I have found his weekly newsletter, The French Press, to be a reliable source of wisdom and insight in matters of law, politics, faith, and culture. David French, I'm so happy that you are on the Habit Podcast today. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We don't get a lot of political pundits around here. That's not really
good for you. Good for you.
Yeah. And so,
you seem like a happy person.
Yeah. As you and I were discussing earlier, I didn't invite you onto the podcast to talk about politics, even though that's your area of specialty, one of your areas of specialty. What I'm interested in is hearing you talk about how does one tell the truth in an environment in which truth is devalued, in which ideology blinds us or makes us uninterested in reality. So I can ask you another question if that's helpful, or you can just start talking about what it's like to communicate in this environment.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a question with a very long answer. So I'll just start to answer it and just jump in if I'm start to monologue too much. But I think one of the first things that you have to do when you are talking and you're thinking, and when you're communicating in general, you have to think hard about who is your audience, and are you to focus your energy around talking to people who are persuadable. Mm-hmm. Okay. Because not everybody's persuadable. I mean, there's anybody who's a communicator in any area, whether you're a trial lawyer or a litigator like I used to be, whether you're whether you're making a movie or music, you're not reaching out to a public whose minds are all completely open to you.
Yeah.
Even the most popular entertainment in the world, think like, Avengers Endgame. There's a whole swath of people are never going to darken the doors of a movie theater to see a superhero movie. So, so you're always thinking about who is persuadable and on what basis are they persuadable. And that's foremost in my mind when I am writing. Okay. I'm writing for an audience that I perceive to be persuadable. I'm typically not writing to change the minds of deep partisans. Okay. And there's a good reason for that. And it's not that I don't think that we shouldn't dialogue with people who have a deep level of partisanship, that we shouldn't be in relationship with people. Of course. I mean, that's, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, friends. I mean, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when I'm writing about culture or politics or law or religion. And I learned something very interesting when I was doing research for my book, which came out in September of 2020. Now, coming up on 18 months ago. Wow. When I was researching American partisan divisions, I came across this really interesting bit of research. I was talking to folks who are specialized in understanding conflict and civil conflict. And they said when somebody is a deeply committed partisan, they experience even an encounter with negative facts, not just argument, but facts, in the same way that you experience an attack. It triggers a fight or flight reaction. It triggers it triggers almost an involuntary emotional reaction. And so that begins when you understand that. You begin to understand why, for example, you can't sort of fix a problem by like forwarding around fact checks. Or you can't send this article and say, read this and change your mind. There's a lot of spade work that has to be done before someone's mind is even open to an argument. And so my goal is to write to people who are open, to write for people who are curious, and then to try to understand what is it that makes them curious? What are they curious about? What are the things that are of most interest to them that would be most persuasive if I'm trying to persuade, or most interesting to them if I'm just simply trying to inform or do an analysis? So I'm really thinking along those lines, which sounds all very common sense until you realize that an enormous amount of conversation, cultural, political, religious conversation is not aimed in that direction at all.
Right.
It is aimed in the direction of sort of reinforcing priors and reinforcing pre-existing propositions.
Yeah.
And so
it pays the bill. I mean, that's a lot easier to pay the bills. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, at the Dispatch, y'all decided to. I mean, you can correct me if I've got this wrong, but from my understanding, when Steve and Jonah started the Dispatch and then hired you, the goal there was not to speak to deep partisans, but to speak to people who were hopefully persuadable. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was trying to reach a community of people, and it's a large community of Americans who fit within what you would call, and what's a group that has been labeled as the exhausted majority in America. Now, the exhausted majority is not the moderate middle. Okay, this is something that's a big misnomer. Okay. The exhausted majority are people on the left, in the middle, and on the right who are exhausted by our current toxic political environment. So they tend not to be ideologues. In other words, they are open to compromise and conversation, but they might be pretty firmly on the left or pretty firmly on the right, but they're open and they're tired. And who's speaking to them? And because, the interesting thing is political, if you look at the numbers, so, Fox News is the titan of political, of cable news. But in any given night, it's reaching between 3 and 4 million Americans. That's only about 1 out of every 100 or so Americans are watching Fox News. So there's this enormous number of people who are not really engaged in the partisanship of the press. but who do want to know what's going on in this world and in our culture. And that's who we're aiming towards. And, our readership reflects that. It's all over the map politically. I would say it's
so. You said it's all over the map. Is it evenly divided along?
No, it's not evenly. As best as we can determine, because Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg and I, we came out of the conservative world and the conservative movement. So the majority of our following is conservative. But I would say a majority of our following is disaffected conservative, not partisan and not deeply partisan committed. And so I would say our audience is more on the right than the left, but we have a far more heterodox following than a lot of other publications founded by conservatives.
Yeah. Can I return to a phrase you used a few minutes ago? That is, you used the term negative facts.
Yeah.
Which, when you think about it, is an odd turn of phrase, right?
Yeah.
Facts are just facts.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, that's probably a naive way to put it. But there is such thing as reality that we didn't invent in our brains, right? There's reality that we didn't make up.
Yeah.
And one would hope that persuasion is a matter of helping people align with realities.
Right.
And yet, but we have it in our head that there are such thing as negative realities. Like there are things that we wish weren't true, and therefore we are willing to lie about it, to fearmonger about it.
Or you can sincerely believe things that are just flat out wrong. So for example, a negative fact would be if you are basing some of your political activism on an idea that, say, in a given jurisdiction, more people voted than were registered voters in the city. Okay. And you say, well, then therefore I'm going to protest, therefore I'm going to believe an election was stolen, therefore. But your fundamental, the factual assertion that you're basing your activism upon is wrong. That's a negative fact. And that requires a lot of backtracking. It might even require apology. It might, to adopt that and to understand that as a fact has implications that can be very negative for you. Yeah. So, let's just take, for example, without diving too much into politics, let's just say you're a conspiracy theorist about the moon landing. Okay. And you belong to a community of conspiracy theorists around the moon landing. Those are your friends who agree with you about the moon landing. Maybe that's where you make part of your living, as you sort of do YouTubes about the moon landing. And then, one day you encounter somebody who has fairly easily debunked a lot of your fundamental factual assertions. Everything within you is going to want to reject that. And it's not just because, you've made your living. It's sort of this high level, it's going to cost me money. Okay. Hey, that's part of it, but there's so much more to it. It's your relationships, it's your friendships, it's your community, it's your identity. And this is what Jonathan Haidt talks about when he talks about the difference between the rider and the elephant in persuasion. So the rider is your rational mind. That's the part of you that says 2 + 2 = 4. Got it. The elephant is everything else. It's your geography, it's your ethnicity, it's your religion, it's your relationships, everything. And what Haidt says, if the elephant doesn't want to move, the elephant isn't moving. Yeah. So the rider could say to the elephant, move. But if the elephant doesn't want to move, it's not going to move. But if the elephant wants to move, the rider is coming along. And so a trial lawyer, for example, kind of gets this instinctively. What a trial lawyer is trying to do, and what I tried to do when I had trials, job one was to make the jury, I couldn't make them, but try to get the jury to want to rule for my client. And then you kind of backfill all of that with the reasons to rule. Yeah. So and so a lot of persuasion, I mean, again, this is something that's instinctive to a lot of people and to a lot of people in the persuasion business. And it's also one reason why we are often moved towards falsehoods because the falsehood hits our elephant in the right way. The falsehood makes the elephant happy.
Yeah.
And so when the elephant is happy, the rider is going along. And I mean, this is, of course, a simplified way of looking at it. But once you understand that, you really begin to understand why people do what they do, why people stand where they stand. And it's, it's a very illuminating way of understanding how people make decisions.
You said earlier that you're trying to write to the people who are persuadable. How does that relate to the elephant and the rider? Does that mean you're talking to the elephant most of the time? Or are you...
I'm often talking to people where the elephant is already moving them in some, like the elephant is indicating some willingness to move. And so the elephant is susceptible to the influence of the rider, that the elephant has got some flexibility. The elephant doesn't know quite where to go. Okay. And then so that's who I'm trying to write for. And that's what that means is that you're often trying to be very openly understanding of alternative points of view. Mm-hmm. You're trying to understand where people are coming from, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you're wishy-washy and equivocating. You're understanding, and you're trying to illuminate or show a better path. And now, a lot of people get really upset at that, but the people who tend to really get upset at that are people where their elephant is in one particular place and ain't budging. Yeah. The people who are more, they may not be persuaded at the end of the day, but they appreciate the effort to engage. Yeah.
So you end up angering a lot of people with the things you write.
Oh gosh, yeah.
How did you reach? Did you reach a point where you just said people are just going to be angry, and that's just what's going to happen? I mean, tell me how or if you came to terms with that truth.
I'll tell you when I come to terms with it.
Okay. Yeah.
It's, the honest reality is that I think if you have a hard heart, I think it's actually a dangerous thing to get a hard heart towards hatred from other people. In this sense, I think you do have to develop somewhat of a thick skin, or you're just paralyzed. You won't say anything, right? But at the same time, you have to understand, like, I write about very complicated things. I write about, the history and philosophy of the behind the American Constitution. I write about race in the United States. I write about religious liberty. I write about abortion. Almost every sort of third rail in American politics and culture is like my beat. I don't write about monetary policy, for example. I don't write about inflation. I say very little about tax rates or free trade, or, my beat is kind of some of the cultural flashpoints in America. And all of these issues are hard and complicated. Mm-hmm. They're hard and complicated. And if you wall yourself off to critique, even angrily delivered critique, you're in many ways, you become part of the problem, because you become somebody who's set in your ways, who displays an arrogance that's unbiblical. I mean, Micah 6:8 says we should act justly, do what we believe is right, but love kindness. And here's the critical last part of it: walk humbly before the Lord our God. The Bible says we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. And so you have to be open. But by being open, that does make you vulnerable. And I have to say that I don't think I'll ever get used to hatred. And maybe I shouldn't ever get used to hatred.
Yeah. My friend Helena Sorensen, we've talked about this before on this podcast. We writing teachers talk to writers about getting a thick skin. And she says, it's the thin skin is part of what qualifies me to do the work. Being sensitive and being open and being vulnerable. Yeah. And so I've told so many people they need to get a thick skin. And then after talking to Helena, I thought, maybe maybe not. Well, like you said, you got to have a thick skin in one sense and a pretty thin skin in another.
The way I've tried to put it, because it's sort of hard to formulate, a thick skin and a soft heart.
Yeah.
An open heart, thick skin, but an open heart. In other words, you have to reach a certain point where people just hurling insults at you doesn't deter you, because that's one way that people try to shut down discourse in this country, is just by inflicting enough pain that you don't say what you believe to be true, kind of out of a stimulus and response kind of way.
Right.
That's like, if I say what I believe to be true, I'm going to get shocked with this cattle prod. and I don't want to get shocked with the cattle prod, so I'm not going to say what I think is true. And this is not just a dynamic, by the way, for public figures. I mean, we all know people who say, I would say X or Y or Z, but it's going to make so-and-so, Uncle Jim, Aunt Betty, my brother, my best friend, really mad. And so that's the cattle prod, is that the person who sort of escalates and sort of imposes a cost on the conversation often ends up dictating the terms of the conversation, just because you don't want to get shocked with that cattle prod.
Yeah. Okay. So there are so many forces at work to oppose telling the truth.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, the thing that made me originally think I've got to get David French on the Habit podcast was a Sunday morning newsletter you sent out. The French Press is the name of your Sunday morning newsletter.
That's right.
French Dispatch was taken.
Well, that was a movie. So.
And you this was the name of the particular episode was A Whiff of Civil War in the Air.
Yeah.
And you talked about this idea that and maybe you can help me out here, because now I'm not doing a great job of summarizing this, but in essence, we believe, we have this habit of believing, we believe that anybody to the left of us is a communist, anybody to the right of us is a fascist.
Yeah.
It becomes this outlandish, exaggerated sense of just how bad, that everybody thinks that people who disagree with them are a threat to democracy, and that kind of escalation is is itself a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
And then you put it in terms of the 9th commandment: "Thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor." And you say, one of the great tragedies of our time is that a nation oppressed by malice and misinformation should be ready to receive a Christian message of love and truth. It's exactly now that a healthy church could be a beacon in the darkness. And yet, not all of us Christians are committed to telling the truth, because lying works, man. And can you imagine the kid who, I don't remember the first time I told a lie, but I can imagine if, somebody says, "Did you break this thing?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, okay." And they go find somebody else to blame it on. That must have been a thrill.
Well, the interesting thing is, and the reason I brought up the 9th commandment. So yes, number one, lying works. It over the short term, especially, lying works. We've seen that, for example, in the election, the post-election contest, there were just an avalanche of untruths that you hear them long enough from voices that you trust enough, and you're going to believe them. It just works. But the interesting thing about the 9th commandment, so I'm in the PCA, so Westminster, I'm all about the Westminster Larger Catechism. And I love the way the Westminster Larger Catechism sort of expands upon and articulates this 9th commandment. Now listen to some of these words and think about them in the context of politics, because we have to remember that politics is not a Christianity free zone, right? I mean, every single aspect of our lives should be transformed and renewed by the gospel. Every single including our political interactions, including our political engagement. You can't just say, well, politics ain't beanbag and write it off and say, well, this is where the rules don't apply. But I love this. The duties required, this is for the Westminster Larger Catechism, the duties required in the Ninth Commandment are the preserving and promoting of truth between man and the good name of our neighbor, as well as our own. Keeps going on and says, we need to speak the truth and only the truth in matters of judgment and justice and all other things whatsoever. We have to have a charitable esteem of our neighbors, loving, desiring, and rejoicing in their good name, sorrowing for and covering of their infirmities, freely acknowledging of their gifts and graces, defending their innocency, a ready receiving of a good report, and an unwillingness to admit of an evil report.
Wow.
That's convicting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's convicting.
Yeah. It's fun to hear bad things about people who disagree with you.
Oh, it's validating.
Yeah.
It's valid. It's deeply validating to get, if you are suspicious of somebody or you dislike somebody and you see across your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed some report about them, and it can, trigger those endorphins, I guess, like that. Aha.
It's a lot easier than going for a run,
Yeah. But then, we often don't even inquire as to whether or not it's actually true. And we just sort of hit the headline, get their affirmation and move on. And as we know, our recent political history has been littered with allegations by left against the right and right against the left that have proven to be either flat out untrue or completely unsupported by the evidence. And that's why we have to be careful. We have to be unwilling to admit of the evil report.
Yeah. No, I loved that that passage from the Westminster Catechism, which you had put in your letter. And as I said, that was when I really wanted to just sit down and have a conversation with you. So can we, I think this is a related issue. Can we talk about pluralism? First of all, can you tell me the difference help me understand the difference between pluralism and just straight up sort of moral relativism or talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people think that if you embrace pluralism, that you're embracing relativism. Mm-hmm. That in essence, so pluralism is essentially, I think one of the most important documents in American history is James Madison and Federalist Number 10. Because what you have to understand about early America is we look back on it now and we say, oh, that wasn't a very diverse country. It was all just various different strands of like white Protestants with a smattering of Catholics, and then who obviously oppressed and enslaved, Black Americans at the time. And you go, well, that wasn't that diverse. But the reality is, if you look at the eastern seaboard of the U.S. in colonial era, you're looking at, Puritans in Massachusetts. You're looking at Rhode Island, which included a lot of people who were refugees from the Puritans in Massachusetts. You had Quakers in Pennsylvania. You had Catholics in Maryland. You had Anglicans in Virginia. You had criminals in Georgia, where they're still there. And you had all of these different factions, which had proven in Europe to just be perfectly capable of going to war with each other in vicious, deadly, genocidal warfare. The wars of religion we were not that far removed from the wars of religion. And what Madison said was not that, all these viewpoints are equally valid. That's relativism. That's saying, it doesn't matter if you're Puritan or Catholic or any other faith, they're all equally valid. No, we need to give people who have competing truth claims equal access to the public square. People who have competing truth claims should be able to live in harmony with one another. And so how do you do that? You don't do that by saying, well, everyone's truth claims are equally valid. You do that by saying each one of you has a space, a place in this country to advocate for what you believe to be true and to live out what you believe to be true. So, for example, if right now in this country, we do not think it is remarkable at all to drive down a street and to have a mosque in one place, a synagogue in another place, and a church in another place. Mm-hmm. But that's a miracle of American pluralism. That is not the historical norm to have that degree. And yet, in that church, the people who are in the church are not saying Judaism or Islam are equally valid. They're saying, no, we want people to be Christians. And, in a synagogue, they're not saying Christianity is equally valid. So that's not relativism, it's pluralism. What pluralism does is it gives you, if you have deep beliefs that conflict with the deep beliefs of your neighbor, you both have a space and you both have a place. And who knows, one might convince the other one, but the other one can't coerce the other one.
Yeah. So you say in the same letter I was talking about a minute ago, we're not going to make our way through the wilderness by exaggerating disagreement.
Yeah.
But we're also not going to do it by minimizing our differences either. And that seems relevant to what you're talking about here, right? In a, in a community, we can, as you said, have a mosque and a synagogue and a church. And one way to live in peace is to not exaggerate our differences, but we don't, as you said, we have a forum, hopefully, where we can discuss our differences. And you said this isn't a squishy moderation that asks members of our political and religious communities to abandon or alter their fundamental beliefs as a condition of full participation in American society.
Yeah. One of the ways that I put it is fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. Mm-hmm. So I can defend the religious liberty of a mosque without believing the truth claims that Muhammad makes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm fully capable of doing that because one of the things is the liberty that they exercise. One of the things about liberty and in understanding the rule of law surrounding liberty is that when another person's liberty grows, so does mine. Mm-hmm. So does mine. And so, I could in one day file an amicus brief in court saying, First Mosque of Franklin or whatever is fully entitled to constitutional rights. And then the very next day I could go debate the imam about a point of faith or a point of theology. And those two things are perfectly consistent with each other in a pluralistic society. And where we begin to break down is where we say that my truth claims are so self-evident and my virtue is so self-evident that I should be privileged in the assertion of my point of view over and above, say, the mosque. Mm-hmm. Or when somebody says, the very idea that you have a better idea than the imam is problematic and should be suppressed. That your moral assertions by themselves are problematic. That's the relativism. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about relativism is it's never really truly consistent because, the idea that all truth claims are equally valid is itself a truth claim. But anyway, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But the point stands that there's a fundamentally different relativism and pluralism are just fundamentally different concepts.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate the idea, that you mentioned a minute ago that as everybody's freedom grows, my freedom grows. And I think it's easy in areas of cultural conflict to start thinking in terms of a zero-sum game and losers and winners. And, my prosperity depends on you having less prosperity, or it's going to be hard for me to flourish if you flourish. My definition of flourishing is comparative in such a way that if you flourish less, then by comparison, I must be flourishing more. And these kinds of things that are pretty detrimental to our culture. Okay.
Can I give you a super concrete example of how?
Please do.
So I'll give you a great example. Let's go to one of the most divisive Supreme Court cases of the Obama era, the Hobby Lobby case. You remember this. This is where the Hobby Lobby wanted a partial exemption from the Obamacare contraception mandate. Went to the Supreme Court, and it really broke down on right-left lines. Most people on the right were like, yay, Hobby Lobby, this is religious freedom. and a lot of people, most people on the left were no. This is an infringement on women's rights. This is a coercive religion.
Mm-hmm.
And the Supreme Court very narrowly 5-4 said Hobby Lobby had a religious liberty right under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to be exempt from portions of the Obamacare contraception mandate. Fast forward several years, and a group of left-wing religious individuals were leaving food and drink for immigrants, for people who are illegal immigrants who are crossing illegally into this country, so that they wouldn't starve or die of exposure in a harsh wilderness. But they were trespassing on federal land, and they were prosecuted criminally.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, no, we have a religious liberty right to our religion compels us to care for the stranger, to compel for the refugee. And so this is what we're doing. And the court ruled for them in what was one of the cases that the court used to rule for these left-wing religious immigration activists, Hobby Lobby. And so it wasn't just the case that when Hobby Lobby won, that only conservative Christians won. When Hobby Lobby won, people of faith won. And so that's what I mean when I say that when a religious liberty claim is vindicated in court, it expands all of our freedom. It expands, it makes the pie bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of your recurring themes in your Sunday letters is, essentially, yes, I am a political commentator, but politics aren't the be all end all of how we're going to solve our cultural problems or personal problems or whatever. And more than that, you say with many other people that as our religious and community commitments decline, those get replaced by a religious fervor that gets redirected to politics. Sometimes. And in a recent, another one of your Sunday letters, you said, we have a small, we can either have a large influence on a small number of people, or a small influence on a large number of people. Right. And the way we treat our family and our neighbors ultimately is more important than our political obsessions.
By far.
Yeah. And I think if I'd said ultimately, I should have even said ultimately, like not just ultimately, but right this minute. It's more important. And yet you spend your work days trying to have an impact on a large number of people.
Yeah.
I know. That's what writers do,
fully
right?
cognizant.
So,
I would say for me, one of the things, and we have different roles, and we have, so for example, a pastor has more of an ability to impact a large number of people than almost anyone else in his church.
Yeah.
Okay. Because he has a platform where he's speaking to a large number of people.
Yeah.
A lot of people look to that pastor. So there are individuals in America who do have, and as part of the function of what they do and the platform that they have more influence on a larger number of people than the average person does. A president has a lot of cultural influence, more cultural influence maybe than any other single person in the U.S., but the president doesn't have as much cultural influence, maybe on a person or personal influence on a person than say like your father or your mother.
Yeah.
They certainly have more. And so, God has blessed me with a platform so that there are more people that read what I write than, say the average person, or more people who might look to me for understanding about the Supreme Court and the Constitution than the average person. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put that in perspective, not just for everyone else, but for me as well.
Yeah.
For me as well, that the reality is what is far more important is the way people are loving their families, building their families, loving their churches, building their churches, than the most viral tweet or article that I've ever written.
Yeah.
And if that tweet or article or podcast or speech or whatever can play sort of any kind of constructive role, then I'm thankful.
Yeah.
I'm thankful. But I know where, truthfully, these words sit in the hierarchy. And so, that's one of the things that I think that we're losing in our country is this idea that we're often putting a lot more of our energy and efforts into the things where we have the least impact, truthfully. And energy and efforts aren't just like time. Pretty much everyone actually spends more time with their family than they do watching cable news, for example. But I'm also talking about mental energy and mental. Where's your mind? Where's your heart? And so an awful lot of us are moving that mind and that heart away from the 6 inches in front of your face, the person across the table, the friend at the other end of the phone call, into what's happening in the San Francisco Unified School District and their intolerable policies regarding school opening, which those are important. They're especially important to parents in San Francisco. But we spend a lot of our time really torn up about what's out here. And often miss what's up in our face, or it influences the way we interact with people who are right here, right in our face. And that's what I'm trying to use what little influence I have, to the extent that I have influence, is to maybe say, maybe this is self-defeating, maybe to say, spend less time thinking about like the stuff I write about and more time thinking about, how can I repair this fractured relationship with Uncle Jim? And, one of the things I tried to do, because I began to see, because I'm in I've experienced just people, even up close and personal in my life, just being horrible to me and to my family. I mean, I remember there was a moment when I publicly opposed Roy Moore for Senate. And I will never forget walking into my son's basketball game at a Christian school in Tennessee, and I saw two families literally turn their backs to me. They literally, and these are people I'd known for a long time, they turned their backs because I didn't support Roy Moore. And so one of the things that I've tried to do is I can't control if somebody is going to stay in relationship with me. But I'll tell you what, I don't want to fracture a relationship with I don't want to be the person who fractures a relationship over a political disagreement. And that's not to say that politics doesn't matter. It does matter. It's my career to think about it. But I'm trying to put into place a hierarchy of relationships and a hierarchy of priorities.
Yeah. There are a few people you determine their bedtime, for instance. that you've got a big impact on. Lord willing.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, one of the things that I try to point out is, and I also am fully aware that I'm speaking often to an audience that is among the more politically interested and politically focused in the U.S. And so in some ways, I'm speaking to an audience that, along with me, some of us are part of the problem. And so, I do think that there's and part of it is to try to help people understand why are things the way they are. That's a big part of, I view that as a big part of my job, is to help people understand why are things the way they are. And one of the things I write about a lot is, why are people so intense about politics? And part of the answer is because of the degrading of these other first order relationships, the loss of these first order relationships, collapsing families, less engagement in civic associations and churches, sort of a less of a sense of a meaning and purpose in the world that's up close to you. But we still have a desperate desire for meaning and purpose, right? It's built within us. And so then you latch on to something that's maybe further from you, or latch on to politics when other things crumble. And one of the points I made, and I titled a piece this, there are wounds that politics can't heal. That there's a sense of emptiness, or a sense of longing, or a sense of meaning, a lost sense of meaning, that politics can be sort of like the shiny new thing for a while, but it's ultimately deeply unfulfilling.
That's one of the that particular newsletter is one of the ones I was reading from just a minute ago. And we need to wrap up here, but I think something that's especially relevant for writers that you say in that letter, you're quoting your podcast co-host Curtis Chang from your new podcast, Good Faith. And he said, Curtis Chang talks about hope as locating oneself within a larger story, specifically a story that has a past that fills us with longing, a future that pays off on that longing, and a present that engages our energies.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time talking to writers about the importance of telling a truer story than the one the world is telling.
Mm-hmm.
And, in politics is a matter of storytelling. And sometimes the stories are true and a lot of times they're not.
Well, and that's the beauty of a healthy functioning church is you can take a person who can walk in that door whose their story is gone wrong. Mm-hmm. They don't have a past that they can look back with any kind of hope or any. They don't have a past that has any warmth. Their present is fractured. Their future is uncertain. And the beauty of the gospel story is that you become part of that gospel story. Yeah. In a functioning, healthy church, you become part of that healthy community. You are grafted into this story. And I think that's something why a healthy church is so vital in this incredibly fractious time where so many people's stories have gone wrong. Mm-hmm. So many people's stories have gone awry and they don't see a happy ending. They definitely don't see any kind of past worth longing for. And then because of no hope in the future, no real past to connect with, their present is empty. And that's where so many people are right now. And that's one of the reasons why I've often urged that the church itself has got to get out of the partisan political business. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that you don't vote, and that doesn't mean that maybe you don't even run for office, but we can't have that as part of our definition of who we are.
Yeah.
Because we want as many people to connect with the gospel story without feeling like they also have to connect with the Republican story or the Democratic story. Yeah. That's a distraction from the gospel story. And again, it doesn't mean that once you understand and engage in that gospel story, that it doesn't have implications with how we interact in the body politic. But that partisan identity is not just secondary or tertiary, it's irrelevant compared to that gospel identity.
Yeah. Well, David French, I'm really grateful for the way that you tell the truer story. I usually agree with you. Sometimes I don't. But what I'm really grateful for is the way your way of telling the story is true too.
Oh, well, thank you.
So thank you. Thank you for your work. And thanks for being on the Habit Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a real privilege.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. To check out more of our podcasts, visit rabbitroom.com/podcast. Our work at The Rabbit Room would be impossible without the generous support of our membership. If you'd like to learn more about membership at The Rabbit Room, visit rabbitroom.com/member. And thanks for listening.
The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.